We are standing in the 300 block of High Street, or Market Street as it's known today, and this was a space closely associated with Benjamin Franklin from the first day he arrived here on October 6, 1723, when he encountered very near this spot his future wife Deborah, the beginning of a 44-year marriage. And the space is interpreted now by the National Park Service, which it's kind of an unusual space. It's in some respects like a lot of Founding Fathers' houses, and we'll have looked at a few pictures of famous ones of those. But the NPS made the decision after Independence National Historical Park was created in 1948 to preserve this, the last home, the site of the death of Dr. Benjamin Franklin. As we've seen, he had lots of houses around this area of eastern Philadelphia. And remarkably, when they began the plan to interpret this space, the buildings here in the 300 block of Market were very much like the Victorian buildings across the street. Additional floors had been added, the facades or the facing on the buildings had been changed, but they made a really remarkable discovery, and that was as we move in here, the historical architects began to watch as they tore apart this arch and discovered that the building was actually the very building that Ben Franklin had built after he got back from being our first ambassador to Paris. He wrote to a friend that it was funny to be building so late in life, but decided to do it anyway, and he always said if you're going to build modern. So it was in these buildings that he used new techniques of fire protection and other scientific means of protecting the house from electrical storms. And so if we step into here, as we step into here, we can get a sense of Franklin's world. It was through this archway that he would have passed every day to attend every one of the meetings for the Constitutional Convention. It's from here he would have left to preside as president of the state of Pennsylvania. And it's through this passageway that his coffin would have gone in April of 1790 before his burial over at Christ Church Burial Ground, which is about 3 blocks from where I'm standing right now. And we have with us today a VIP guest. This is Carrie Deethorn, who in the National Park Service is the chief curator here. Carrie is an old friend, and we've worked on a lot of projects together over the years. And Carrie gets to make sure this is all preserved and interpreted correctly. And we're going to walk into a pretty unusual national park. You won't see any bears or waterfalls, but well, let's take a look in, shall we? The National Park Service made the decision not to create another Colonial Williamsburg in Philadelphia. It was and is a living city. So instead of making all costumed houses, interpreted or period piece houses, they turned the buildings along Market Street into things showing Ben Franklin's mind. In the 1960s, this was finished. There is an active U.S. Post Office, which for those of you pondering marriage, I've been told by the clerks there is one of the favorite places for intendants to drop off their invitation so you can have a hand-stamped Ben Franklin postmark on it. I know people who do their Christmas cards there every year. Over here is an interpreted display called Fragments of Franklin Court. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we can't go in today, but it is one of my favorite museums in Philadelphia. The Park Service made the decision to disassemble the later rooms in the house, but to take it down to the archaeological finds. And so you can look at how a house was constructed and what was found underneath it. And a lot of what we know, as Carrie, one of the collections she curates is the archaeological collection here, and they have a massive, how many archaeological pieces do you have?
From Franklin Court?
Overall in the park?
Oh, overall we have 2 million.
So that's a lot of pieces of broken china, little pieces of dolls, old nails. And I've always argued in a lot of ways, a Penn professor named John Cotter kind of gives birth to the idea of historical archaeology here. Archaeology isn't just digging up a burial mound, or if you've seen the movie The Dig on Netflix this winter, but we can look at documentation and we can look at stuff. And one of my favorite parts of Franklin Court is right here. This is the water well of Deborah Reed's family. This is where they pulled their drinking water, and the water they used to boil soup or make tea. And in a younger day, I used to leap from one to the other. But right there is the Franklin's privy pit. So you're looking at water going in, or liquid going in, and other stuff, and drinking water coming out. I don't know that the public health majors among the class probably would be very enamored of this idea, but you'll notice that Benjamin Franklin makes a big deal about being a water drinker when he's in London, and people thought that was pretty weird. Most Americans, most Anglo-Americans at the time, drank beer for breakfast. It was a big deal in Philadelphia. They drank hard cider. John Adams makes comments about it. So this is probably one of the reasons. The water here wasn't very pure. It certainly wasn't very sweet. But the great thing about all of these is when the national park came in here, they had the resources and the time and the inclination. So you go around Franklin Court and you'll see all these little time capsules of different dates in which pits were dug. And the custom of the time was at the end, when a well or a privy had used up its lifetime, you dumped your garbage into it. So the National Park Service has an active archaeology lab going right now. Mostly everything you're digging or they're processing now is from the National Constitution Center site. So if you have an archaeological site on your house or in your garden, don't dig into it. You need to be a trained archaeologist to understand it, although it's awfully fascinating when you get to watch it take place. And when we look at Franklin's life in London, we'll look at some archaeology from there to see how Anglo-America was processing in this. Initially, one of the plans of Independence National Park was to tear down the buildings that were here and maybe to put up a statue of Franklin in the center of this square. Or at one point, there were even discussions of rebuilding the house. But as a former NPS employee often said to me, we don't rebuild fake historic buildings anymore. And there was never enough data to recreate Benjamin Franklin's house. A lot of historic sites did that in the early part of the 20th century. Some infamously built the wrong house on the wrong spot. George Washington's birthplace, which had disappeared over the years, they built the wrong house on the wrong spot. Thomas Jefferson's birthplace near Charlottesville, Virginia, they built the wrong house on the wrong spot. And it was so wrong that eventually they sold the house, moved it into town, and turned it into a restaurant. So rebuilding houses doesn't really happen much anymore, except in places like Colonial Williamsburg, where that's sort of their main trade. So you can get a sense, though, of this is Benjamin Franklin's space, and we'll have looked a little bit at this in the PowerPoint you will have seen right before we start filming this. But this is kind of an odd space to live in, but a wonderful one too. Unlike a lot of 18th century men and families, Franklin didn't long for a country estate. He, as we've seen in the class, he was a guy of the city. He liked Philadelphia, and while he had bought a farm in New Jersey by the 1730s, we believe, he never really wanted to move out of town. He didn't build a country house along the Schuylkill River or even up the Delaware River like a lot of his friends and contemporaries who could afford to do so. Instead, he built on land that he'd been piecing together since he opened his own print shop. It was some of the land he had inherited and bought from his Reed in-laws, where I'm standing right now, and then pieced together this parcel. So by the time he got back from London in 1762, Franklin could start to plan building his dream house. It is a house that isn't facing a street, so the problems of living right on the street. Philadelphia, like London, is a row house city. So it wasn't right on the street. It's set back, I think it's 175 feet to the front door, if I remember the measurement correctly. So it's a lot of open space around it. While he's in London, Deborah buys the parcel on either side of the house, a strip of land for 900 pounds sterling. So she said it makes the house make more sense to have equal space on either side of it. And they begin to plan this. And we can go over to see how the Park Service interpreted this. Carrie, was the site finished in the 70s?
Yeah.
For the bicentennial?
Yeah. And this might actually be a good time, George, to talk about why the house isn't here anymore.
Yeah.
That's a common question. people who come to historic sites expect there to be historic sites, meaning actual buildings and places they can go in and look around. And as George has been explaining, we don't know anything about Franklin's house. And you might say, well, he was such a famous person. Nobody made a drawing, nobody wrote a description, and the answer is no. So because we don't have that kind of documentary or physical evidence, the house was actually demolished in the early part of the 19th century. It had been after Franklin died and his family moved out, they sold it, it was a hotel. And that sort of doesn't sit very well with us in the 21st century. We say to ourselves, but Franklin was a founding father. Didn't people respect his house enough to preserve it? And the answer is no, because it's a city, real estate is valuable, and you want to sell it and reuse it. And that's really the main reason why the house doesn't exist, was because even in the lifetime of Franklin's own daughter, Sally, the house was simply an asset. And she sold it in order to make money, and then it wasn't preserved. And what happened to this place where we're standing over the course of the 19th and early 20th century is it changed dramatically. There were many, many other structures here. We're standing right with this very easy to see road, which is called Oriana Street, a lane that goes right through the block. And that was wide enough in the early 20th century for a car to drive down it. And on either side of it were buildings that were called tenements. They were housing for working class people. And the ground level had risen up so high that when the site was excavated by the Park Service in order to find what might remain from Franklin's time, the mounds of dirt were 30 feet tall, just trying to get deep enough to find the foundations from the 18th century. So this little courtyard, this little plot of land changed dramatically over the course of the 150 years after Franklin died. And what the Park Service's goal was, as George was saying, not to recreate literally the environment that Franklin would have seen, but rather to create a site that's representational so that we can talk about Franklin as a citizen of a larger city. In other words, that Franklin's experience is like the experience of his peers who had similar occupations and similar life histories. And that's really the purpose of Franklin Court, is not just to talk about Franklin, but to talk about Franklin as a representative individual of a time in which there was a great deal of social, economic, and political progress.
Can you remind us, during the time where Franklin's house actually was here, what were the bounds of like the city of Philadelphia?
Mm-hmm.
Like when did it start becoming more like a country area?
So at the time of the American Revolution, there were about 35,000 people living in Philadelphia, including Franklin. And the city extended from the waterfront to about 10th Street. So once you got out past 8th Street and you're heading towards 9th and 10th Street, it's getting pretty rural. The houses aren't all built close together like row houses. There's a lot of space in between. So it was about 10 blocks, at the time of the Revolution, it's about 10 blocks wide and about 8 blocks deep. So about South Street today was the southern boundary, and the northern boundary was what we refer to as Race Street. Pretty small for 35,000 people to live, and the reason that worked out was because the interiors of blocks were built up. So Franklin owning the entire interior of the block, that's a little unusual. Most of the time what block interiors were like were there was a street or an alley running through and then houses on either side of it.
So is the size of this structure about the size of like what you think his house would have been, or is it more
Yes.
of an artistic representation?
No, it is.
Oh, okay.
And you're actually looking at two different steel frames. So the one that's closest to us that has the large orange high reach parked underneath it is a representation of the print shop that was built for Franklin's grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache. So it's a little two-story building, as you can see. And beyond that, the taller structure was Franklin's house.
Okay.
And the dimensions of that taller structure are based on the archaeological remains of the foundation, which we can take a look at shortly.
One of Franklin's many inventions was fire insurance and creating what still exists as the Philadelphia Contribution Ship. And one of the wonderful things the Contribution Ship has done is they have a professional archivist, and they have archived since the mid-18th century all the insurance plans And one of the great things of that is for people in Carrie's line of work, they've preserved these, and if you wanted to insure your house, you had to have a survey done on it. And they went, literally, they measured your house, they said which room was plaster, which one had wood paneling, what kind of a fireplace you had, and all this stuff. So we know the precise measurements of these buildings that Benjamin Franklin insured. So a lot of folks have asked me as a professional historian, can I tell them anything about their house? And I said, well, I can tell you if you were insured, as a lot of people were, it was a very profitable endeavor, then this is, so that's another way we know this. The class is going to read Franklin's will in a few weeks, Carrie, and he talks about these two buildings, the Franklin Courthouse that went to Richard Bache and Sally, Franklin's daughter, and also what Franklin refers to as my printing house. So that's a pretty good size workspace. I mean, he's, I've wondered when he built this, how the family reacted to having this sort of clanging, noisy, active business so close to the door of the house, but
Well, remember, he was more than even just printing. I mean, he's also the post office, he's a dry goods store. So the first floor would have been probably the shop, and then the second floor would have included supplies and all kinds of equipment. And then the attic maybe, was publications bound up for sale or something like that.
yeah. So it's a, one of the things, and I know people have gotten angry at the Franklin and the Bache family who inherited for not preserving it. But Sally and Richard had a large number of children, and if we're going to divide up an estate, unless you're on one of these home shows on HGTV, when the couples are always talking about, our 8 children will be inheriting this, we want them to still be able to share the cottage in Maine, and you're like, I'm not going to share a house with my siblings, no way. So that was the reason. So, and there just wasn't historic preservation yet. Or if there was, if you wanted to preserve something, you thought you did it because you wanted to preserve the home of a king. But England and Europe tore down old palaces.
Well,
to make way
buildings
for new
get
streets.
preserved because they're still useful.
Yeah.
And if somebody decides, well, this house it's old-fashioned, we don't like where it's located, we want to move someplace else, then down it comes.
Yeah, and it's if you can imagine this. I mean, you are right in the middle of the city in the 1760s, and by 1812, this is a packed, busy, smoky, stinky city. The Delaware River is 3.5 blocks away, and the Delaware River by the mid-19th century got really stinky as modern sewers started emptying into it. So nobody really was longing to live here the way Ben and Deborah had loved. She said to be in the driveway on the lane leading into Franklin Court on a hot summer day was the most pleasant place in town. I don't think that was necessarily the case anymore by 1812. So, do you want to walk up and show them your site, Carrie?
Sure.
Let's take. Everybody safe? I always, if I could bring the class here in person, maybe by May, when we're done with the semester, we'll be able to, will the park be open by then, do you think?
I hope so.
If they would have ended this pandemic. But in 1948, this was a busy little Philadelphia lane, sort of like Church Alley a few blocks over from here, with cars zooming up and down this, even through that 18th century arch. So the NPS had a lot to figure out. So we're looking here, we're standing in one of the 2 Robert Venturi designed steel frames. I have teased several park superintendents that these remind me of monkey houses at the zoo, if you just added some wire frame around it. But so far, no monkeys, just historians. And this is the site where Franklin lived.
So we'll walk up to what would have been the back door of his house, and you can see ahead of us these concrete structures, and what those provide is the opportunity to look down below the ground and see the archaeological foundations of the original house.
And I'll be showing the class some pictures of guesses of this. But the original house is a square 3-story house with what's called a dormer, a space like over there up top with windows facing out. And so Franklin's building what is a pretty grand house. But as we learned in class, by this time you see this, it will be last week, Franklin has an income of around 2,000 pounds a year at this point in his life. So I can see you all, I take off my mask because my glasses are fogging badly. But that is a big income. He's making more annual income than the royal governor of most of the royal colonies. So he's got a good amount of money, and he begins building this house. It's designed by Robert Smith, we believe, who was the preeminent architect and builder in Philadelphia at the point. It's overseen by one of Franklin's closest friends, and it is a pretty grand house with a hall and a couple parlors and a dining room on the first floor, multiple bedrooms on the second, including Franklin's bedroom was on the north side of the house, which would have been right here, and that's the room in which he died, we believe. And then by the time he returns from Paris in 1785, it's Sally and Richard and their 7 living children are going to be filling this up. So Franklin does an unusual thing. He is an old man by any account. He's 79 years old at this point, and he begins adding on to this pretty substantial house. Fortunately, Deborah had bought the extra land, so he builds a large addition on the side, and that includes a new dining room, where, among other things, the American Philosophical Society would have their meetings. On the second floor was Franklin's book room, and we know from an account of a minister's wife who came to visit here right after Franklin's funeral that room up there was packed, the walls were packed with his massive library, some of which is at Penn, some of which is the American Philosophical Society, some at the Library Company now, and his scientific equipment. And some of that survives at the Franklin Institute. His desk is now in the rare book room at Penn. So it's a pretty crowded house. And then the third floor was a music room. And we don't often think about Franklin as a musician, but he and his daughter Sarah, or Sally as he called her, were both musicians. They made a very grand room that we'll talk a little bit more in the discussion in PowerPoint about. But Carrie, I'm stepping on literally your territory.
Yeah, don't forget there's another step here. You're going to down in here through the glass, and you can see some rather nondescript foundations, stone foundations from Franklin's original home. And on the wall there is a floor plan to help you out a little bit. And George was mentioning how sophisticated the house was in terms of how many rooms and the quality of how the rooms were painted and furnished. And one of the most important rooms in the house, which gets a lot of coverage in the letters between Deborah and Ben, is the kitchen, which was in the cellar. And you can actually see here on this floor plan the sort of pinkish areas. That's the foundation that we're looking at. We're looking at part of the kitchen. So you can see here where there's a blue square around the very small aspect on the right-hand side of the kitchen. And as you can imagine, the kitchen of an inventor like Franklin was full of household conveniences. So stoves, water heaters, a special clock that would turn the spit in a fireplace so you didn't have to crank it by hand. And I imagine that Deborah enjoyed those inventions, but she also probably said things like, "Another invention? I've had enough, Ben. Give me a break. I can't use all this stuff as it is." But the kitchen, you could actually walk in from the outside, and it was very large. And I think it's one of those places that in any home is really the heart of the home. And Deborah obviously spent quite a lot of time there, since that was her job, to oversee the management of the household as well as the business when Ben was away.
And it's here that he did a lot of entertaining of the other delegates. 55 men gathered to write the Constitution in 1787. 39 would actually sign it, to review what we did a few weeks ago. Many of them will report coming here. It's sort of the first stop of anybody coming to Philadelphia, whether you're a politician, a revolutionary, a military leader like George Washington, who was here very frequently, or a scientist. And Franklin, who had a sort of an odd personality in that he really liked having his friends from wherever come and be a part of his life wherever he ended up. One of his close friends is a man named Samuel Vaughan, and Vaughan will be the one. Vaughan is a scientist, another philosopher from London, who will resettle to Philadelphia, and he'll be the one that gives us the dramatic account that the only time he'd ever seen such a gathering was the crowd that gathered outside Franklin Court for Franklin's funeral procession in April of 1790. Franklin also had a family that maybe by our post-Victorian standards the Franklin family must have been a little unusual. When he died in April of 1790, his bedside is surrounded by Sally's children, his grandchildren, by the illegitimate son of his illegitimate son, and also by the daughter that he'd sort of adopted in London. We're going to talk about Mary, or Polly Stevenson. And after she was widowed in London, and after her mother, Franklin's former landlady, died, the Stevens, I'm blanking on Polly's married name. That's a bad sign. Hewson. After Dr. Hewson died, Polly and their children moved here, and she and Sally, Franklin's biological and non-biological daughters, were standing together at Franklin's deathbed. So Franklin had, in addition to having a pretty spacious house, and this is a pretty grand house compared to any surviving home you'd see in Philadelphia, really larger than the Physic House, which I just think is one of the grandest.
Because it's not a row house.
Yeah, it is a pretty grand, pretty elaborate space here, especially for a guy who arrived here with pocket change and with his socks in his pockets. Although I have to admit, if I had a pair of socks on my hands right now, it's 20 degrees right now, so I'm missing my gloves. This is a pretty grand space. I'll promise you all on camera that if the park opens again while we're all still together as a class, or if you're in Philly this summer, as I intend to be, we can all gather here and go on a walk. To give you your orientation of where I am and the filmers are right now, Independence Hall is a block and a half in that direction, where I'm facing Chestnut Street. The port is just a few blocks in that direction, where the Delaware River. It's been moved a little bit since the 18th century. Carpenter's Hall is right over here, a building that Franklin would have known well at various points in his adult life. So this is the center of historic Philadelphia. We'd love to have the Franklin House back. I think I'm glad they didn't build it and build it wrong on the technology of the 1960s. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a fake reproduced house where they got it terribly wrong and now they're trying to figure out what to do with that. So I guess if we want to see any more of Ben Franklin, we all have to go to London together, but we'll let Dr. Emanuel figure out how we're going to fund that trip.